Hey, St. John. Welcome to the Post Sermon Podcast. I am Deaconess Dehlia, and with me today is Vicar James.
Hello, all.
Today, we'll be discussing the sermon from Maundy Thursday. So, how are you doing today?
I'm a little tired.
Now, why would you be tired?
It's Friday. It's Good Friday, so we've been going since yesterday morning. But
Sure.
It's been good so far. So, yeah.
And I was just saying how strange it is to be talking about Maundy Thursday sermon when we just had the Good Friday noon service.
I know, yeah. So
It's different.
yeah, it is a little strange. So
But I'm excited to talk about the sermon. I really enjoyed it and thought you did a great job. But first off, before we get into what your sermon said, what is the text that you preached on?
the primary text was Luke 22:7. So we get this text where Jesus is instituting the Lord's Supper, and it's a really beautiful text. Here he has his disciples together, and he tells them that this is the bread, this bread is his body, and this wine is his blood. And probably the most beautiful part about this entire text is he goes, "And these are for you. These are for you."
Yeah, the focus on God's good gifts to his people. And you did start preaching on another text as well, which gets into, I believe, the central teaching of your sermon, Indifference, right? So tell us about the other text.
Yeah, so when I started to think about this sermon, what jumped out at me was the indifference of the disciples, and then I was immediately thinking about different texts in the Bible where we see this kind of indifference, and I think that these two texts play well together. So the second text would be the parable of the great banquet that Luke talks about in chapter 14. Now this takes place in a section of Luke's gospel where we don't have a lot of time markers, so we're not exactly sure when and where Jesus tells this parable. But I like this parable because it's really good at talking about how people are indifferent to God, and because in some of the other parables, like for example the parable of the vineyard, you have the people in that text, they're hostile to God, but in this text they're just indifferent. They don't really care what's going on, and so I thought that played well into the text that we were preaching today, where the disciples, after he gives them this great gift, his body and his blood. And then they go and they argue about who's the greatest in the kingdom, where they're going to sleep that night. And it just kind of shows you how even those who are so close to God, so close to Jesus, still kind of behave in an indifferent way.
Yeah, that's interesting. And with the parable of the men who turned down the invitations to the feast, had odd excuses, not the best ones. And then you said this is not that different from us as well.
Yeah, that's true. So we, I use myself as example, so I kind of worked backwards in the sermon there. I started with myself and then kind of alluded to others, because I think many of my experiences are very similar to what other people have. There are times when you get up on Sunday morning and you're going, man, I really just want to sleep in today. And so sometimes you do. There's other times when you put other priorities before receiving God's gifts, and you can just go back to church the next time. But of course, then when we're at church, how often are we truly engaged, especially when we have other things going on in our lives?
And that's what I was going to say was you are preaching to people who are in church this is Maundy Thursday as well, so probably a lot of people faithfully go, but you go beyond that. That's not just attending, but are you actually engaged in the service?
Yeah, and then exactly. And the clergy aren't any different, right? And so so that's when I was went to myself. I'm up there actually delivering the Lord's Supper, and sometimes I'm just not really focused on what I'm doing, even when it's my turn to receive it, because you're just kind of moving through that. And I thought that Maundy Thursday was a good time to just try to reestablish that focus. Kind of, what is this all about? God is giving these good and gracious gifts to us, and so we should focus on that. So that's where I was trying to take the sermon.
And was that a challenge when you were trying to think about yourself and your own indifference during the service, like how to include that in a sermon that you're preaching?
Yeah, a little bit. It wasn't a challenge to think about it.
Sure.
I'm well aware of my own sins. Yeah, I wasn't sure how that would come off. So when I went through it, I just kind of felt that some of those things were very common to other people, and so they would be able to relate to them.
Sure. And sometimes people can think someone who works in the church, or even though you're not called yet, but you're still, full time here, that, oh, they just must 100%. They're never indifferent, right? They're not guilty of breaking the third commandment, but saying, no, we're all guilty of this indifference. Yeah. How did you intend to benefit your hearers in their faith or life?
Well, the goal here in the sermon was to really just get them to focus on the gifts that God has given to them, right? And I think, like I said, the problem is that God gives them so graciously to us over and over and over again. They sometimes tend to get lost in the background. Part of the clutter of our lives, we just make them part of one, they're just one thing that we can do amongst the many other things that we can do, so we can spend our weekend going to church, or we can spend our weekend doing something else, and so God's gifts just become part of the things that we do, and they're not really set apart. The sermon really was trying to focus on, God's gifts, His graciousness towards us. I would hope that the hearers would reestablish that focus and see the importance of these gifts, because in the end, the only thing that's going to be left is God and His grace.
Something that I liked that you said was you focus on the disciples' indifference, how it shines through after Jesus institutes the supper, but then He still goes to the cross the next day.
Yeah.
And so I just really liked that connection that you had there.
Yeah, and I think that's the pretty amazing part about our God. He knows all this in advance. I mean, He knows that Vicar Burke is going to be up there being indifferent, doling out the Lord's Supper, yet He still does it. He still is there present for us every time we do this, and He is just that gracious. He lets sinners handle His body. He knows that we're going to make mistakes sometimes.
Even when we spill it.
Yeah, we're going to spill it, or we're going to drop a wafer on the floor. He knows we're going to do these things, yet He's still that gracious that He brings this forgiveness to us through His body and blood anyway, even though He knows all these in advance.
You also mentioned just us being freed from this sinful life too, right? We're not in bondage to this indifference anymore.
Yeah, and that's one of the benefits that the Lord's Supper brings to us, is this assurance of salvation, right? God knows that we need this. We need this assurance of salvation of our life. We need Christ's strength and this comfort. And so He willingly just comes to us, in the Lord's Supper, in His Word and His sacraments, and He gives these things to us.
Tell me something about the text that did not make it into the sermon.
Wow, I don't. There's not really a whole that much that didn't make it into the sermon, because much of the text was about the Lord's Supper. I think the biggest piece may have been the connection to the Passover previously. So you have this first initial part of the text where Jesus is making the preparations and sending His disciples off to find the house. I think that's probably the only real piece that didn't make it into the sermon.
Last thing I wanted to talk about was the connection with the small catechism. So where do we find this teaching of your sermon in the catechism?
In the questions section at the very end of the catechism, he has prepared these questions for people that are going forth to take the sacrament. In fact, and this is what it says. This is the subheading for it. It says, "Prepared by Dr. Martin Luther for those who intend to go to the sacrament." So he intends this as a self-examination process for people who are going to the Lord's Supper. And I think this is really helpful, because these questions help you focus on why it is you're going there and what it is you're going there to receive. Probably the most helpful question is number 9, or the one that brings this largely into focus. And Luther says this. He says, "What has Christ done for you that you trust in Him?" And his answer to the question is, He died for me and shed His blood for me on the cross for the forgiveness of sins. And so Luther really brings out that "for me" part of the Lord's Supper. It is for you that He does this, and we talk about it every time we get together. We do this in remembrance of Him, so that you can understand that the "for you" of forgiveness is there. It is for you. And just a shameless plug for CPH, but they have a really good resource too out there. It's called the Treasury of Daily Prayer, and in the back of that resource is a bit on confession and absolution, and there's a really good section in there on the Ten Commandments, and it asks questions about your sins, and it gets into some really deep questions, because a lot of people go, okay, well, the fifth commandment, thou shalt not murder. I've never murdered anybody, right? But then it goes in and it says, well, have you ever been angry at anybody? And it rolls through these questions. And so it really gets to the heart of sin. And so I think that's another way to prepare too for the Lord's Supper, is to kind of read through those questions and really examine yourself before you go.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. That reminds me, with the Pharisees, they were so focused on the actions that they were not murdering, that they were not lying, but they didn't really care about the heart. And so then Jesus, when he's preaching Sermon on the Mount, he's having us see this goes way deeper than you realize, right? It goes to the attitude of the heart. And so, yeah, like you said, that would be a great resource to look into questions that aren't focusing, sure, you haven't murdered, but have you been angry with someone? Have you hated someone? Have you, numerous examples.
Exactly. I think there's a common refrain out there. It says something like, hate the sinner, hate the sin, love the sinner. But it's actually a lot more than that, because it's not just the sin, right? Not the actual action that is the sin. It's the thought, it's the desire to do it. And like you brought up in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about this, I'd say to you, if anyone has ever looked at a woman with lust in his heart, he's already committed adultery, right? So it's not even the act of adultery. It's the thought. It's the desire to do it. And so, yeah. And so, so it goes far beyond just the action.
Yeah, and I think that especially on this Good Friday, it just really shows our need for a Savior.
Exactly.
That even our own desires are just full of sin.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
This wraps up the episode for today. Thank you for listening to today's discussion. In case you missed today's sermon or want to listen to it again, the link to the sermon's in the show notes. You can also find the sermon on our church website, stjohndublin.org. If you, the listener, would like to submit a question about a sermon, please email us at podcast@stjohndublin.org, or if you'd prefer to text a question, please text the phone number found in the show notes. Thank you, Vicar, for joining me and for feeding us the word this week.
Thanks for having me.
All right, bye.